Good afternoon, everybody. This is Neal Conlon calling in for the AppGuard monthly thought leadership forum. To give anybody who this is their first one of these signing on for, I'll give you a little bit of context about kind of what our mission and what our intention is. The intention in starting this webinar was as a software provider, many of our clients, customers, and people in the industry started to ask us for, subject matter related questions that were related to cybersecurity, but unrelated to our product. And so, in addition to the monthly webinar that we do, that is more of a technical demonstration where we explain how AppGuard works for cybersecurity and C-suite and IT folks. We wanted to put together a thought leadership series of virtual webinars. And what that entails is we reach out to a handful of cybersecurity professionals in various different industries. We ask them a couple of questions, and then we bring them on to this virtual webinar. Our goal and intention is to bring thought leaders from different industries and different verticals to share with the people on these calls these different perspectives that are going on, whether it's from the federal and government space, whether it's in the academic space, or whether it's in technology or compliance, or even in the legal space. So we've had some really, really powerful conversations in the past couple of months. If you're interested in hearing some of the older ones, please do reach out to us afterwards, and we can send links to previous ones. In our first webinar, we had Mark Kelton, Bob Bigman from the government side, so former NSA, former CIA folks, and former DHS folks, explaining some of the concerns that government goes through in an ever-evolving marketplace. We then followed up with state-nation conversations, as in August there were some concerns about some of the news that was going on in the cyberspace around Iran and other state nations. For that webinar, we had a couple hundred people log into it. It was a very powerful conversation. And this topic that we're going to talk about again today, which is, I'll boil it down to what worked in 2018 for cybersecurity, what didn't work for 2018, and what to look out for on the horizon for 2019. We've had so much interest in this topic, both from the panelist side and from the participant side, that we've had to do it twice, which is just fantastic. And so in our series a week and a half ago, we had the CISO of Penn State, Don Welch, and we had a former Army veteran, cyber threat, cyber intelligence, former Bank of America, former government, now going into the private sector, Anthony Cruz, talk about really what they see going on both on the government side and on the academic university side, with different infrastructures, different threats, different concerns. And so I'm really happy to have our next two panelists on the call. I'll let them introduce themselves here in a moment. But what we're going to do is we're going to take all this knowledge from these four different compelling folks. We will be putting out a piece of written content, a blog, that we will share with everybody who's on this call. We'll also share it on our LinkedIn and other social media outlets as well. So you will be able to get access to this information afterwards. So why don't I ask our panelists to do a quick introduction. Annie, why don't you go first, please?
Good afternoon. Annie Jones. I am an energy attorney here at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. I have 12 years of energy policy and regulatory experience here at FERC, the last two of which have been focused on security. Prior to that, I worked on infrastructure development, hydro, natural gas, LNG facilities. I work currently as legal counsel for FERC's newest office, the Office of Energy Infrastructure Security, and I serve kind of a program coordination and communications role for both within our office, between other offices here at FERC, and with our external partners. And just for those who aren't quite sure what FERC is, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, we're an independent agency that's sort of within DOE, but we act independently, and we are governed by a board of 5 commissioners. I think I will leave it at that for now.
Thank you. Thank you. Jonathan?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Jonathan Alboum, and I'm presently the Chief Technology Officer for Public Sector at Veritas Technologies. I started in this role at Veritas a few months ago. Prior to joining Veritas, I spent 11 plus years in the federal government in a number of positions, mostly CIO kinds of jobs at agencies at the Department of Agriculture. I also worked at GSA. I eventually became the CIO for all of USDA in the last administration, and also served in a variety of procurement positions as well as the deputy for all of USDA procurement. So I have a sort of broad perspective around IT, around procurement, and most definitely cybersecurity. In my current role, I work with our customers all over public sector, all levels of government, healthcare, as well as higher education. Thinking about data, how to protect data, how to store data very efficiently, and really helping organizations know what they have and where it's stored, and figuring out ways to reduce risk around that. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Outstanding. Well, definitely appreciate you both being on this call. And I think one of the key factors that went into selecting both of you to be on this call is one of the things that I think most enterprise companies, whether they're public or private, are dealing with in today's ever-evolving cyber environment. Is this is not just a IT problem anymore. This is not just an IT budget consideration. This is something, the world of cybersecurity has to have this, three-legged stool that encompasses compliance, the legal challenges, both from a data breach perspective, which we'll talk about here in a moment, as well as, the company culture and the general understanding of in a environment where, especially just because you mentioned it, Jonathan, healthcare and all these other industries where people are not generally wired or trained outside of maybe doing a couple internal mandated classes, that human error and lack of education really becomes the biggest challenge, I think, for the ecosystem to protect itself. So again, I really appreciate you guys coming to this conversation. I want to build off just a couple of comments that were made in our last webinar, specifically so that we don't just cover them again, and also just because I think they are extremely relevant to this conversation. So in our last webinar, it was like a day or two right after the Facebook breach. And then just a couple days ago, there was the news that Google Plus had admitted that it had very recently been breached. And if any of the folks on this phone call had been at any, I think even RSA this year, or many of the cybersecurity conferences that have gone on this year, whenever they explain who the model or who the best security infrastructures or most secure environments are in the world of IT, most of the speakers that I've heard have always referenced that Google is the number one and Facebook is the number two. And just the fact that now whether or not that's true or not, maybe it's just marketing buzzwords that I can't confirm, but I've heard it multiple times this year that the general consensus is that and now where we are now, the two most secure environments have now been breached in the last 2 weeks. And we're going to get real talk here because I really want to make this a platform where people just talk about concerns, things that are working, things that are not working, things that need to change in the environment. For these types of webinars, it's meant to be kind of a bunch of folks sitting around a table talking about real stuff. So, Annie, let's start with you. From your perspective, right, from the legal mind, from the program management mind, what goes through your mind as we talk about concerns around the Facebook and Google Plus breaches, and how do you kind of talk to people about it?
One of the messages that we try to convey is you can't control whether you're a target, right? And you will be targeted, and if someone wants to get in bad enough, they will. And so we work with our entities through our, we conduct these voluntary architecture assessment programs where we send out our teams of cyber experts to go out and kind of take a look comprehensively at systems, and then just sort of try to promote the best practices that we know. But, you know, I think those are, like you said, these are the two strongest, most secure systems that recognized anyway, and they both got it. So, you know, we last week also the indictment of Russians involved in several different cyber incidents, some of them involving the Olympics, but the one in particular that drew my focus was the targeting of nuclear facility out in Western Pennsylvania. You know, these facilities are, you know, Westinghouse Electric, pretty secure, but very, very creative attempts to attack and target. I think we're gonna just need to make sure that people are prepared for not just trying to keep folks out, but then what is going to be the response if they do get in.
Sure. No, absolutely. And something that the CISO at Penn State brought up in our last webinar was, you know, one of the things that we unfortunately have to get used to in this industry is there are very, very sophisticated you know, minds that are plotting some of these attempts. And then there are, for lack of better words, very no-frills, cheap, inexpensive, uneducated ways to have an equal amount of impact, a negative impact on an infrastructure. And the analogy I believe he used, I'll paraphrase a little bit, as cryptic as it might sound, was, you know, if there was a shooting in a school, you know, the teachers and the administration don't go running looking for security guards at that point, right? Like once they know that that malicious thing has happened, you know, it becomes a time to, you know, go through law enforcement, contact the right type of people, the right quality people, because you know, the IT ops person or even the CTO or CISO, if they're dealing with state hacktivists or state nations or very sophisticated things, they just may or may not be qualified to respond to that in a tactical way that is going to be helpful. Jonathan, from your perspective, and you probably go a little bit deeper here into the technology of it, you know, what are some of the concerns that you think about from an infrastructure perspective, or just even from your own perspective?
Yeah, sure. So I'd just offer that I think, you know, the statement about you can't control if you're going to be a target is right on. And we should all organizations that have to manage security should assume that they will be targets. And I think you should assume that you're going to get breached at some point, because it's our reality. And, you know, my experience as a CIO really tells me that in the end, you're going to be judged more so on how you respond to these things and how you're able to recover, as opposed to the fact that there was a breach. I don't want to say that breaches are commonplace, but, you know, they occur enough, and in organizations like you described that invest so much in security, it's going to happen to us. So how prepared are we for when that moment hits? So as you're you know, suggesting here, is from a sort of technology perspective, one of the concerns I always had was I could never be certain where all the copies of our most sensitive data were. You know, you might say, well, what do you mean? Well, there is, you know, any organization has data that's really critical. It might be PII data, customer data, some things that have to be always protected. But the reality is that our systems are interconnected, and that data is useful across the organization. So people trade it, they share it, and how it's protected by the person that shares it, or maybe shared with a third party, that becomes a really important question, and it almost becomes like a data supply chain question. So how do you ensure that there's good controls around the data, all the places where that data lives? Because an adversary will try and attack your weakest link, and maybe they can't get data from you, but maybe they can get it from a third party. And things like that happened during the OPM breach a few years ago, and that's some of the most sensitive data owned by the government, and it was taken from a third party, or at least access was gained through a third party. So you have to be thinking about this holistically, and you have to be thinking about it from I'd say a very defensive posture, that something bad is going to happen. You need to have your data secured, you need to have the data protection, you need to know what your data is and where it is and all places that it is. And if you don't have that, it's going to be very difficult after that breach happens to tell your customers or citizens who are customers of your agency that their data is safe, and the data, and this is the data that was breached and not any other data. It's really hard to say that if you don't know what and where your data is.
Sure. No, absolutely. And just to back up a second, I just realized that I did not mention this. So if you are listening in on the webinar and you have questions that you would like us to ask, please do feel free to chat them over to Janan, who is running the webinar, and we'll make sure, as long as we have enough time, that we will get through all the questions. And if you have additional questions afterwards or would like to be connected with our panelists directly, we'd be more than happy to facilitate that conversation as well. So definitely appreciate that point. You know, it's not a matter, in most organizations at least, right? It's not a matter of if you're going to get breached. It's when or how long have you been breached. And there is this ongoing you know, conversation that I think happens, that whenever the newest cyber logo comes out, and you know, is the big thing, you know, that is going to protect everybody. You know, within 6 months, I think Gartner mentioned there will be some kind of countermeasure developed that will, you know, almost make that new process, new software, new framework passable in some way, shape, or form. But at the end of the day, what happens is what we've been told, you know, what we've curated with other organizations is it's your cyber stack and what your framework is, and then it becomes a matter of the 3 points, like, and you cannot have a 100% sterile environment for the most part, like at scale, in my opinion. So at some point, you either need to sacrifice, you know, what level of security you're comfortable with. You know, are we comfortable with 96%, or are we comfortable with 86%, or are we comfortable with 99.9%? Are we comfortable with spending, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions upon millions of dollars to protect our infrastructure because of the risk we're trying to mitigate? And then it turns into a amount of.
Can I just jump in there? I think that, you know, you're talking about taking well, I'd like to talk about it in terms of taking a risk-based approach to cybersecurity. You know, ultimately, again, it is about, you know, the data you're trying to protect in your environment, and if you don't really understand the sensitivity of that data, you end up applying all of the same controls across all systems, and that can be very expensive. I strongly advocate, you know, figuring out what the most important stuff is and protecting that in the best way possible, and protecting everything, of course, but doing it based on data sensitivities, whether those are from FISM or some other kind of classification mechanism, but protecting things in the way that they should be protected. It's not a one-size-fits-all. I think when you take the one-size-fits-all approach, you can get really caught up in the complexity of an implementation. If you're able to focus on a few things, the most important things, now you know, do what you're describing there. My project management experience tells me you're going to be more successful in getting that implemented, faster, and, you know, that increases the security of your organization, in my opinion.
Sure. No, absolutely agreed, and very, very good points there. So let's just build off of that real quick and get into kind of some of the points. So Annie, you know, 2018, from your perspective, sitting on top of the FERC and, you know, doing assessments over infrastructure, and seeing how, obviously it's in the news that there's some infrastructure challenges from a cyber perspective. What are some of the points that worked in 2018? What were some of the good things that you've seen come out of it, either in your own travels, from your own perspective?
Sure. So, we also encourage a risk management approach to security. What we consider to be the most critical assets, though, it's slightly different but analogous, right? So, like you mentioned, we're talking about industrial control systems. We're talking about infrastructure more so than strictly being concerned about data. But that doesn't mean that it's not the same kind of analysis that you would go through. So, on the standard side, the energy industry happens to be one of the more heavily regulated industries, and most of the bulk electric system is subject to NERC standards. And you mentioned the difficulties of having a one-size-fits-all security approach and then trying to map it onto a standards program, right? And so in our standards program, it's more sort of like a three-sizes-fits-all, because we categorize the assets as low, medium, and high risk. The office that I work in is separate from the compliance and enforcement side of FERC. And so we are sort of looking at it from a slightly different perspective. Some of the positives we're seeing in 2018, we are seeing more engagement from leadership. So when we go out, we typically insist on having CTO or CISO level, if not CEO level, participation in our reviews, at least for the in-brief and out-brief, because we think that unless we get the leadership involved, then they're not going to have the right support that they need to try to implement the changes that maybe the folks on the tech side, they know what needs to be done, but they need sort of an outside hand to come in and kind of pull back the veil and show. So we're seeing more support for those budgets. We are seeing some refinement of our standards. So we've now had them for enough years that we can kind of see how can we fine tune this and make it better. And we hold regular technical conferences where we invite industry in to help us understand ways that we can make those improvements.
Sure.
I think
Sure.
maybe I'll stop there for now.
Okay, no, definitely appreciate it. And Jonathan, how about from your perspective? What do you think? What improvements? I mean, you've been obviously at this for a long time. So, what are the things that are working, in your opinion, for 2018?
Yeah, so thanks. I think, Annie was describing getting executive support as being very important. And I think in the federal government, there's been, from the White House down, a lot of top cover for agency CIOs and other agency leaders that need to take on cybersecurity challenges. If you can recall back in the beginning of the administration, there was a report written based on an executive order signed by the president on cybersecurity. And that report to the president I think it was called the Report to the President Federal IT Modernization, and laid out many things for agencies to focus on. So this is the White House and the Office of American Innovation and leadership at OMB and elsewhere directing agencies to take discrete actions on cybersecurity. And those are things like focusing on high value assets. It was adjusting security requirements to accelerate cloud, using shared services for cybersecurity like CDM, consolidating networks. So again, there is there's a lot of authority that comes to a CIO when it's coming from that level, and the secretaries of these cabinet agencies are held to account for cybersecurity issues. I think that worked really well, and the overall administration focus on IT modernization, I think, has been good in the same regard. And modernization often includes aspects of improved security, whether it's because we're re-architecting systems that were not designed well, or getting things out of data centers into cloud environments that may come with higher levels of security right off the bat. we're driving towards a more secure government, but that's not enough in my opinion. Sort of pivoting though, what maybe we still need some help on. All the top cover is good and it's table stakes, I think, but getting budgets aligned and creating mechanisms to establish a service that can be used by all agencies. I think those things have taken some steps forward, but from where I sat in the government, where I sit now, it still seems like there's a lot of opportunity there.
Sure. No, absolutely. And I think I like to believe that we've got more awareness going on. So it's not just, I think there's more executives speaking to the fact of, this is not just an IT problem, an IT budget anymore. It seems to be people are becoming just more conscious of a lot of the ramifications. I think Equifax last year, on top of a couple of other ones, kind of brought it to the top of people's priorities in a different way. But obviously, we still have a long way to go.
And I think you're right, and just sort of tack onto that. When you make the agency administrator, or the secretary, or somebody responsible, it really forces them to think about what services they provide to their constituents, and a lot of technology supports those services, and sort of makes them owner of that whole service, that service outcome. And if they're going to be successful service outcomes, people getting benefits or payments going out or whatever it is, they have to be more aware and have more input into how the systems are protected, how the data is protected, who runs these things, where they run, and getting that level of people to realize that they have an ownership stake and responsibility around that. I think that's a really important culture change in the government and elsewhere, I'm sure, that has to occur for these changes to stick and persist past one administration that has a hyper focus on it.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah,
I would
go ahead, Annie.
I was just going to say, and I would just add on the corporate side, we're starting to see not just the literacy and awareness going up at the executive level, obviously, but at the board level. It's basically a requirement now for board members to have a basic literacy and understanding and be able to have conversations with the CISOs so that they have a better understanding of the risks that their company faces.
Well, that's definitely impressive. I mean, I had a conversation yesterday, and the topic of Mark Zuckerberg's testimony to Congress came up, and there were some snickers and some chuckles about how poorly some of the questions from Congress were on the topic, and I look at that as I look at the inverse of that, where how could we actually expect a executive government person who has 4,000 responsibilities and things to be aware of to actually understand what it's like to understand what the data transfer could or couldn't be like between ad API platforms, between let's say WhatsApp and Facebook, outside of having a very, very high level understanding of how that could work. So I think it's very important. I think you both hit on a very, very important piece of making sure that there is executive sponsorship. And the example would be, the company policy is you have to change your password every 90 days, which I think is just a bad policy anyway, but it does exist. And the CEO of the company has not changed his password in 16 months or something like that. And that just proves right off the bat that there is a challenge with kind of executive sponsorship into the cyber conversation. And we see it happening over and over again. So I want to dig into like the bad stuff, because I feel like people ultimately just want to hear some of the bad things. And I'll just throw the one out there because I keep on trying to have conversation with people about it. They don't realize, like, with that Facebook breach that happened a couple of weeks ago, right? Like if your Facebook single sign-on, was used and you were tied into a bunch of other third-party apps, and or your password that you use for Facebook is the same password you use even for your work or personal email or other things. Like, that's the concern, right? Like the concern is that people don't realize that whatever entity, steals 50 million login and passwords, they make their way down to the dark web where they get sold. Then hackers figure out that these 10,000 employees, all work at an investment bank, and the next thing you know, they're popping passwords left and right, and they figure out who didn't have MFA or two-factor authentication, and the next thing you know, they're inserting some kind of ransomware or resetting emails or something like that. Like, I think that's a really, really good example of like a bad thing that's happening in 2018. One, because like the implications are not yet known, but also it's like I feel like the average everyday consumer of technology doesn't understand the complexities. So from both of your perspectives, and Annie, let's work backwards here. I want to ask you, like, what do you think is not going well, or what's a bad thing that we need to focus on that's a challenge for 2018?
So on I guess I'm going to turn back again to the ICS side, and we're seeing throughout 2017 and 2018, unfortunately, increasingly sophisticated and targeted attacks. So and the tools are becoming more generally available to carry out this kind of attack. In the past, required a level of sophistication and understanding of a particular entity's system that just isn't required anymore, because there's built-in modules that can be tailored and exploited, and online libraries that actors can draw from. And so that's a significant problem that we're seeing. And sort of carrying off of what I had talked about before, with how our standards are broken into those three different categories of low, medium, and high risk assets. One of the unintended consequences that we're seeing now of that is that we have a high level of concentration of supply chain vendors that serve the energy industry as a whole. And the problem with that is, if you have a high degree of penetration of up into 50, 60% served by a single vendor of all of the low value assets, well, those assets don't need to meet the most stringent of our standards. And that makes targeting a lot easier if you can target their vendor and they serve such a high percentage of the industry. So that's something that the Commission's kind of working on now, is how can we develop a supply chain standard to help industry understand the questions that they need to be asking of vendors, and carry out that responsibility that they have to thoroughly guard against those kind of concerns.
Sure. Jonathan, how about you?
Yeah, I would. So I'd agree with Annie's comments there. I think supply chain is really critical. One of the things that we see is that organizations are scrambling to comply with privacy regulations. And if you look in the EU, the General Data Protection Regulations, GDPR, that hit earlier this year in May, and California recently passed a similar kind of privacy law. And, as I work with customers in our public sector, we see pretty clearly that compliance is very difficult because there has not been good data governance over a long period of time. And when you don't govern your data effectively, it's very difficult to know where all the personally identifiable information is. And if I'm a customer of your organization or a citizen of your agency, and I say, under maybe future laws that I know are pending, delete my data, or I don't want to be associated with this program anymore. And there's a responsibility to, delete a customer's data or remove them from a particular application. It's very difficult to do that, and you can't if you don't have a mastery of your data. And if you don't have a mastery of your data, you're never going to be a digital organization. You're never going to gain the real value of data integration and data-driven decisions comprehensively. So there's things that I think are related. So this is just highlighting, for me and some of my colleagues that across organizations, data stewardship, which also is something I think we need to push into business areas and programs, along with some of the technology that supports, the management of data and data security. Those things haven't received historically the attention they should, especially in large federated organizations. It's a little bit scattershot what kind of capabilities are where. So it feels like we need to pause for a little bit within these organizations and take a very focused look at understanding what and where and how we've stored things. And most of the organizations I deal with, they're focused on the security of data, not necessarily a physical asset, but the data that runs their programs or runs their systems. And they don't have a good enough handle on those things just yet.
Sure, absolutely. No, appreciate that completely. So we had a question come in from Samantha. As you were mentioning GDPR, she's asking. I'm assuming this is to Jonathan because you brought it up. Do you think that GDPR will have a positive impact on reducing risk in the cyber community?
So I say yes, because again, the organizations that we work with, and where I've seen this personally to some degree, there's now a focus on deleting data that you no longer need. We are by nature data hoarders. We do it in our personal lives with copies and copies of old pictures and other things. We do it in our professional lives with copies of files and PowerPoint presentations stored in your email and on a network drive and maybe your hard drive. So the data's everywhere. And GDPR really forces a change in the way we interact with our data, be it in a database or in some unstructured format, such that we only need to store one copy of these things. We don't store lots and lots of copies. So if that's what we get out of GDPR, more efficient approaches to storing data, we have, in my opinion, by default, improved our cyber posture, because now there's less stuff in your organization that a bad guy can find when they get in and they're sneaking around. And, as we said in the beginning, people are going to get breached. It's sort of a fact of our environment. And if we are, if we have if we have environments that have data everywhere and not an unmanaged data, when somebody gets in and they start poking around, they're more likely than not to find something. So that's from my perspective how things improve. Plus, it just creates greater awareness and stewardship and clear roles and responsibilities perhaps around data in environments of social, which will also make us more secure, I think.
Sure. Annie, over on your side, are you facilitating or having the GDPR conversation and what it could or couldn't, or how productive it could be to help with the conversation around cyber?
Not so much. I was in a conference last week though, where I think I would agree that it will have a good impact eventually. I think in the sort of immediate future, it's causing a lot of hand-wringing and consternation, particularly among attorneys. I think the 72-hour trigger is very difficult. There's so many unknowns when you're right in the middle of a potential breach, and I think that there's the immediate backlash is, well, we're not going to ever call anything a breach, right? Since it's not really a defined term. So I think I think eventually it will. I think the other part is, I think a U.S.-centric versus European-centric view of compliance. Most U.S. corporations are typically now very compliance heavy and try to sort of be in 100% compliance. And when you have sort of this gray area of, is it a breach? Has it been 72 hours yet? That's really difficult for people to kind of wrap their heads around. And I think some of the European corporations are a little less, it's just more focused on a culture of compliance in general, without sort of finding these boxes and making sure that you're squarely within the box.
Yeah,
sure.
and,
that was my takeaway.
the penalties for GDPR noncompliance are really significant. It's some percentage of company revenues. So, I think, you're right, Annie, in the EU, there's maybe more of a culture towards this, but, the potential fines, I think, have heightened that. I would say, just as you sort of answered the question, and I work with a lot of lawyers and government, I'm like, okay, that's a lawyer's response. In terms of, is it a breach or not? It's like looking at the very fine legal definition of it. I think about it just a little bit differently from the IT practitioner side. And, I get that, it's 72 hours or whatever that period of time is. We need to respond and make something public. And if it's 73 hours, that's not as good as 72 hours. 71 hours is maybe better. But the idea that I'm thinking about is we're going to get better comprehensively about understanding that something has happened and being able to get information out to people to begin to remediate the situation. And I'm less focused on the letter of the law, quite honestly. I'm more focused on, the positive outcome of detecting breaches and making appropriate notifications and remediating the situation. Because again, I think those are the things that, we get judged on as IT leaders when these things happen. Sooner the better, faster the better, but I'm more excited about the idea that we're going to create this sort of muscle around something happened and we'll go ahead and make a notification and remediate the situation.
Sure. So for anybody who just is listening and may not be aware of pieces of this conversation, the GDPR is a new data compliance framework that was mandatory for Europe at I believe, the beginning of this year, and it has been slowly rolling out across the United States. If an enterprise company is headquartered in Europe, but they have locations and different offices in the U.S., they probably are already managing it. And there is a section in it, in Section 9, and I spoke on a panel about this a couple of months ago, around data breaches, and the company has 72 hours within finding or being made aware of a breach to notify proper authorities or law enforcement of a breach having occurred. And if they do not, there is very, very significant fines in place for that organization. And this is really meant to be kind of a preventative measure to not let companies go on for 6, 8, 12 months, without informing their customers or their employees that, personal or private information or transactional or financial information or IP has now leaked out in some way into the infrastructure. And I think just to finish the thought there, what I think is interesting is I think we're in this period where, to Annie's point, and Jonathan, you hinted on it, where people are still trying to understand like the legal jargon of what each line item means, and then how to implement those things, from an infrastructure perspective, at people perspective, culture perspective. But what I think it does is like one of the things that it will change kind of the framework, the other existing frameworks that are out there. So, just for a quick example, and I really want to hear what Jonathan, your comments are here. There's a lot of folks out there. A couple of years ago, the idea of detect, deter, and remediating, was kind of like the buzzword, right? It was the acronym for a lot of these organizations and a lot of the software that's been rolled out. And the idea, the cost, the amount of effort, and the level of skill that is needed as many of these organizations become more technology and more data focused to maintain this kind of detect, deter, and remediate philosophy, I think is very challenging to align when you have different compliance methodologies like GDPR rolling out. And so it's almost like some of the basics of, people were saying last year that perimeter defense, for example, was dying because of machine learning and AI and other stuff like that. But some of the basic fundamentals around, something as simple as a zero trust framework, or putting a better perimeter on the outside, or reinforcing it before it gets inside. I think that you're going to see this resurgence, I think, in getting back to basics, because that's just, the ideology of history repeats itself, right? We keep on trying to do something super complex. We realize that the complex thing isn't the really big solution, and then we go back to the basics of something else. It's just kind of how we maybe think. But what were you going to say, Jonathan? I'm curious to hear. Jonathan,
yeah, I don't want to talk. Yeah, I am. I don't want to talk too much more about GDPR, but I was just going to say the data breach piece is very, very important. But the piece that we see more scrutiny around and consternation around is this idea of the right to be forgotten. That as a customer, you can tell your provider, delete my data. I don't want to be your customer anymore, and then that data has to be deleted. With subject to some regulations, and that's really hard when, again, you haven't managed your data or governed it very well. So, just wanted to add that. We'll move on to zero trust networks and other things.
Sure. No, absolutely. So we've got about 12 minutes left here. So I want to make sure I get through kind of one or two more questions. So from Eric is asking, for people who are planning budgets and people who are planning out what their 2019 cyber strategy looks like, what are the areas that our panelists see that still need to improve? Do we need more software? Do we need more people? Do we need less people, etc.? Annie, you want to take a stab at that one from your seat?
Yeah, I don't know if I have a good pat answer for this one. I think partly because the entities that we deal with are so diverse. I mean, we deal with some very small entities to some of the largest corporations in the country, and so it's really gonna differ.
So maybe can I ask you just to pick real quick in your head like a large one and just kind of hone in on one thing that might be interesting to folks who are listening?
I think there's a lot more attention in the energy industry as to how they're going to deal with cloud in a way that is going to maintain the resilience of the energy infrastructure, and how they can do that in a standards-based environment. And so that's going to be both technology investments. It's going to be investments in people. But that's definitely a growth area that we're seeing.
Sure. And how about you, Jonathan?
I would say look at the NIST Risk Management Framework 2.0 that's going to be rolling out soon. The first version of the Risk Management Framework, is very popular because it gave agencies the opportunity to tailor security controls based on security sensitivities of particular systems, again, kind of that risk-based approach I mentioned before. The next version, is going to have some new controls around supply chain, which we've already touched on, privacy, which we've touched on, and also the integration of security engineering into the application development process. More things for people to do as they build systems and manage IT, but guided in a way that I think is going to have a positive impact in the government and elsewhere. I'd also, based on my, research and understanding about the RMF, next version of the RMF, it's also going to integrate with the cybersecurity framework. And, that cybersecurity framework was implemented by NIST to create some security controls around critical infrastructure. And it came out of the need for energy and water companies, power companies to have a framework around cybersecurity. So it'd be interesting to see as, maybe for Annie and some of her work, as this next version of the risk management framework rolls out, will some of the organizations that she deals with or some other sort of critical things that are defined as critical infrastructure have a roadmap to improving their cybersecurity and implementing cloud, as she's describing, in maybe a more controlled way based on some guidelines that are coming soon.
Sure. Sure. No, absolutely true. Okay, so we got two quick questions that I think we can get through. One of them I have to laugh at. So somebody's asking, so which one is truly more secure in your opinion, Microsoft-based or Apple-based infrastructures? Anybody? I mean, I'm willing to ask that question because I think it's a good one for people to be aware of. But for the panelists, do you guys have an opinion on that? I personally would say I think Apple does a better job of portraying that it is more secure than Windows. But do you guys have an opinion or no opinion?
I personally don't have an opinion.
I have no professional opinion.
Got it. I wouldn't want to be held accountable to that one either. Okay. Okay, so let's. There's another couple questions, and I'll make sure to get them over to you guys, and maybe we can connect you guys to those questions afterwards. I just want to be conscious of everyone's time. We've had a significant amount of people on this panel, and I really appreciate when they're engaged and staying through to the end. But let's ask the question around, what's beyond the horizon now. 2009 people are all getting ready to do budget planning. They're thinking about compliance. They're thinking about the initiatives for what to put into the board decks for next year. What are the things on the horizon that either A, are encouraging, exciting, or even the things that keep you folks up at night that you wonder about how we're going to conquer and talk about the next breach in, I don't know, Q2 of 2019? What do you guys think is forward thinking a little bit?
So,
I can start. Whoops.
Oh, go ahead, Annie. Go ahead. You go first.
I was just going to start and say I haven't talked about this yet, but one of the encouraging things that we're seeing in the energy industry is a higher adoption of what they're calling cyber mutual assistance. So energy companies have mutual assistance agreements when a natural disaster strikes, where they'll come to the aid of another entity. And we're seeing a rollout of those same kinds of agreements in the cyber realm. And I just heard at the end of last week, there's currently about 150 participating entities representing about 80% of U.S. electricity customers. That these companies serve about 80% of U.S. electricity customers. So we see that as a really positive sign, and they're overcoming some of the unique challenges that cyber faces versus a physical storm, both in terms of regional scope, predictability, but they're doing it in a way that seems to be able to address this concern of, okay, well, then what happens once there is an incident? The one other point I wanted to make with that is that these can roll out proactively too. So it doesn't necessarily have to be following a significant incident. It can be if we're seeing an escalating drumbeat and indicators of vulnerabilities, these can be triggered, and arrangements can start coalescing to harden up systems in advance of an anticipated attack.
Sure, absolutely.
A couple things. One, I would build on that and say, within most organizations, there's some kind of security operations center, and there's more and more tools being implemented in SOCs across government and different organizations. All of the data that's being generated by those different tools, all that log data, really it becomes a big data problem. How do you get information from the tons and tons of data that are created, such that there's actionable steps that can be taken by a human in that security operations center, or some kind of automated policy-driven approach that shuts off the system, takes something off the network, moves an endpoint that appears to be doing something bad into a walled-off area. So I'd say let's look for more automation for detection of cybersecurity events. Use the big data analytics capabilities that we're developing in different parts of our businesses, organizations, for the purpose of cybersecurity, and then agreeing what can be done in an automated way, and what maybe needs immediate attention by a human to dive in and act. That's one thing. And the other is I look at all of the connected devices we have in our lives now, from Fitbits and smartwatches and Amazon Echoes and Google Home devices and all these different things all over the place. Nest thermostats, all these things are being, they're sold as commercial technologies. They may show up in offices in some form or fashion. We have a lot of smart buildings, and all those devices have to be secured, right? And they, I don't know how they all work per se, but I'm sure that there are default passwords and that there are, they're made to be consumer friendly, so they're simple. Simple doesn't always relate to secure. So we're creating more risk within our homes and our offices, perhaps, as we integrate these connected technologies. And we don't necessarily think about them as IT devices. A lot of smart buildings that I've been in or been in meetings about creating a smart building, the folks that manage the building aren't recognizing that they are now IT portfolio managers, because they have tons of systems in that building that have to be managed and secured, and all those devices are connected. So that's creating more risk for us. So I'm looking as things evolve for probably some kind of incidents, and unfortunately some serious kinds, that are going to wake everybody up to the fact that everybody needs a security operations center in their home, or in a building and in these different locations. We're just not necessarily, in my opinion, we're not really understanding the risk we're creating by connecting all these things. And that sort of goes on to the IoT, Internet of Things conversation, and how these devices will add more data. Yet not only does that data have to be managed, it has to be secured, and you have to do similar things like with log data to create value out of it. So these activities are going to be more and more common in my opinion.
Sure. No, absolutely. So I just want to be conscious of time here, and before a bunch of people jump off here, I want to mention one final thing. So one of the managed services providers that we have a partnership with, and I won't mention the name just because we have agreed that this is meant to be a thought leadership forum and not shameless plugs for anybody. But they've donated 4 Jocko Willenick books called Dictonomy to help promote this podcast, this webinar, and we're going to do a podcast in the near future as well. So for the folks that are still on this call, I'd like to ask folks if you would be so kind as to go on LinkedIn after this, share maybe a takeaway or a thought on social media, tag AppGuard to it, and we will make sure to select 4 winners and make sure to get you a copy of that book in the mail very promptly. And ultimately, we're looking to build a community and a forum here where folks like Jonathan and Annie and other industry leaders can share some of their experiences. So I really appreciate everybody tuning in, and I look forward to doing the next one in November, of which we'll start to put out content around that soon. So thanks again, everybody, for tuning in, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.